My name's Katrina Walser from Oliphant, and I'm a knitting teacher and designer based in Sydney in Australia. And welcome to my monthly podcast on the needles. So before we begin, in the spirit of reconciliation, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I stand, the Darug people. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So it's currently the middle of March, which means this is episode 18, I think. And sorry that this is a bit later than normal. I usually try and post at the beginning of the month, but I got a bit distracted this month. But that's okay, it just means I have more stuff to show you. So if you're new here, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. It's a knitting podcast. I talk about my whips and FOs, and then also I have some other chat where we just talk about like general life things towards the end, and also what's happening next month. I am a designer and a teacher, so a lot of the time stuff we're talking about are like designs and things that I'm doing, and also classes and stuff that I'm teaching, but there's also a lot of just general knitting chatter because I also knit a lot for fun too. So, let's think. Oh, I also have links down below to everywhere else you can find me on the internet. So on Instagram and on Ko-fi if you want to shout me a coffee, and in my email newsletter. If any of you are subscribed to my newsletter, which quite a few people have recently, so thank you very much, you do get a free pattern, but other than that, I've been really quiet with my newsletter, so I'm hoping to change that. I'll probably send like a catch-up email just to let everyone in the newsletter know what's been happening in the last couple of months, and then hopefully I'll pick that back up again with just like updates on what's been going on and just like whenever there is actual news. Yeah, so I've got a lot to show you today, so let's just get into it. So the first section of my podcast is always on the needles, which is where I show you all of my FOs and my whips. Alrighty, so the first FO I have to show you is a scarf, and it is not actually something that I've been knitting. It's something that I knit last July or August, but I haven't been able to talk about it until now. So if you saw my end of year wrap-up video, I mentioned that I had made a scarf, and it's a design for a company, and usually when that happens there's a really long lead time between when you knit the thing and design it and when it actually comes out. So this one in particular has just been a really long time coming. So very, very exciting. It was released by Pearl Soho, and if any of you don't know who Pearl Soho are, they are a yarn company based out of New York. But the reason that they're quite popular in the knitting community is they release very high quality, very simple and like straightforward but beautiful looking patterns, and the majority of them are for free. So you just go onto their website and you can just get a bunch of really pretty free patterns. I feel like in retrospect that all sounds a little up myself because I'm now including my pattern in that list. But yeah, it's really exciting to have been working with them and to have like, I don't know. Okay, let me explain a little bit. So Pearl Soho was sort of aspirational. I never thought that I would be able to publish a pattern with them, mostly because I didn't think that I was good enough, honestly. And they have a very particular aesthetic that I just didn't feel like I matched. Everything in their lines are very clean and very classic looking, and I feel like a lot of what I design is a little more chaotic is the wrong word, but it's just a bit more like I'm into patterns and colors and textures and stuff. And so it just doesn't really sort of fit the aesthetic. And honestly, I just didn't think I was like good enough. But big shout out to Maddie from the Mad About You podcast. If you don't know Maddie, she is another Australian podcaster, and I will link to her podcast down below because it's definitely worth a watch if you like Aussie podcasts. And she actually encouraged me to apply, so thank you very much, Maddie. So the way Pearl Soho works is that you have to apply to be on their designer list, and then once you're on the designer list, you have to apply for individual patterns. So I think they accepted this pattern, must be like a year, maybe 18 months ago now. So it's been a really long time coming. I guess I should show you what it actually looks like. So this is the ticking rib scarf, which they actually suggested the pattern name, and I didn't know what ticking rib meant. It turns out the ticking material is a type of fabric that has very like distinct lines going across it, and so that's where the name comes from. So if you look at the texture, it's very simple. It's just mostly stockinette, and it has these very like distinct slip stitch lines, and so it's a really, really easy pattern to do. Obviously, you can just take a look at it because it is just free on the internet. Again, I'll post a link to it down below. And yeah, it's just a nice, like, relaxing knit. It is a fingering weight or like 4-ply scarf, so you have to be a little bit patient. But if you're in the mood for just something like relaxing, that doesn't take much brain power, it's a really good one. Now, the pattern is written for line weight. So I have a skein of it here. This is 100% wool. What do they call it? Oh, it's 100% merino. And it's single ply, which means it is very light and very, very squishy. And it's just got this lovely like halo to it. Hopefully that's showing up on the camera. And then the tassels are made out of something called quartz, which is merino and suri alpaca. And this stuff is gorgeous. The reason that the tassels are made out of this is because single ply yarn, and especially the line weight I've seen, it tends to felt very easily and like pill. And so if you make tassels out of this stuff, it just turns into this big sort of like felted mess quite quickly. So it's really nice when you knit it up because the knitting gives it some structure, but when you just like leave strands loose, they tend to twist around each other and then just get sort of matted together. So the tassels are in quartz. Now, Pearl Soho actually, if you're watching this like around the time of release, so today is the 16th, I think, of March, they're actually on sale at the moment. So I haven't looked exactly how much different skeins of these are, but I do definitely know that the line weight at least is on sale. So if you want to grab some, you can go do that. No code or anything, that's just on sale. And they also have bundles. So they have like suggested colors for the scarf. This is not one of the suggested pairings, but it's just what I had on hand. So I think it's 2 skeins for the scarf version and 4 skeins for the wrap version. And then you always get 1 skein of the quartz because it doesn't take too much to make the tassels. So I'll leave it as an exercise to you to do the maths and figure out if the bundle is more cost efficient than the yarn that's on sale right now. I haven't actually sat down and priced it out. For my Australian friends, if you don't want to deal with the shipping, then the yardages or like the meterage for how much yarn you actually need in each color is on the pattern. So you can substitute for pretty much any 4-ply yarn really, but a single ply yarn would be really nice because of just how the texture works out. So yeah, that's the ticking rib scarf. I hope you guys have fun with it. If you decide to knit it, definitely let me know, especially coming up to winter for my Aussie friends. Okay, the other FO I have to show you is my terrain tee, which is what I'm wearing. So I was talking about this last month. I have actually finished it. I am not going to stand up and try and show you because it is really hard to show. It's a little bit longer, but I did take some pictures, so I'll post them here. Props to my best friend Jade, who took the photos. It's really funny. Jade is a bodybuilder, and so she knows how to pose because when you go into comps, like you have to pose, and she was trying to get me to pose like a body. Anyway, it's fine. We got some nice photos out of it in the end, but it was a fun sort of photo shooty session. The terrain tee is by We Are Knitters. It is a kit of theirs, and the yarn is the cotton. This color I think is called terracotta, and I knit it on 4.5mm needles, which is slightly smaller than the recommended needle, which did mean that my gauge was a bit tighter. It's just that I liked the fabric better. I've tried to knit this yarn on 5mm needles before, and it just ends up being a bit gapey, which is fine for like baby blankets and stuff, which is what I've mostly used the cotton for before, but for a top, not so much because it's sort of see-through. So I knit at a tighter gauge, and I didn't size up because the recommended size for me was a size 2, and that was going to give me like quite a bit of positive ease. It was like 4 or 5 inches, and I didn't want that much positive ease, especially in a t-shirt. So I was okay with it coming out a bit smaller because my gauge was tighter. So I just stuck to the size 2. Now, last time I showed this to you, I had, I think, the whole of the front panel and then a little bit of the back. Didn't take too much longer to do the back. And then what I did, I ended up constructing it quite differently to what it recommended in the pattern. And I'm going to go through it now for you, because if you do have a very simple drop-shouldered top that's just 2 rectangles put together, then I think some of the ways that I did this might be helpful, because I found like some of the ways that I did it quite handy actually, in ways that surprised me. So I'll just go through that now. So first off, I cast on with a provisional cast on. So if you look at the pictures, there is a panel at the bottom of the top that is in a different texture. And I didn't know how long I wanted the top to be, and it is knit bottom up. So what I did is I cast on provisionally, and I worked both the front and the back panels up from the sections where the texture changed. So I didn't have that bottom panel in the just like plain ribbing on the front and the back before I put them together. And because I figured that way, I could see how long the different sections were, and then I could add as much length as I wanted, working top down at the end. So after I finished the front and the back, I seamed the shoulder seams together with a 3 needle bind off. So the pattern recommends that you just bind the tops off and then sew them together. But what I did was I left the stitches live, and that gave me a couple of different options. First off, it let me do a 3 needle bind off, which if you haven't done a 3 needle bind off before, it's a way of seaming pieces together, especially it's really common with like shoulder seams. And it involves knitting instead of sewing. So that's always nice, because I like knitting better than sewing. And if you want more details, I have a tutorial on how to do a 3 needle bind off. So on one side, I did my bind off from the shoulder and then into the neck. And then on the other side, I did my bind off also from the shoulder into the neck. But what I then did, and also what a 3 needle bind off lets you do, is that because you're knitting, it means you don't have to cut the yarn to a particular length. If you're doing something like mattress stitch, you actually have to cut the yarn and then do the sewing. But with a 3 needle bind off, because it's knit, you can leave the yarn attached to the ball. So once I was finished with my bind off here in the corner, what that left me with was 2 bound off shoulders and then live stitches here at the front and at the back. And so then what I did is that I kept the yarn attached from the 3 needle bind off, and I picked all of the stitches back up and I put them on the needles on the front and the back. And then I did an I-cord bind off all the way around. And so that means that from this shoulder to the front and then the back, it's all just one continuous piece of yarn. And it meant that I could get this I-cord bind off, which I like a bit better than just like a raw, just regular bind off. I just like the look of it better. So after I did all that seaming and the neckline, I blocked it and I just let it dry. And then I put the side seams together. And so in a similar vein, I like crochet better than I like sewing. And so I tend to like doing a crochet seam instead of using mattress stitch. Again, if you don't know how to do this or you haven't seen it before, I have a tutorial on how to do it. Don't get scared off by the fact that you need a crochet hook, because it's actually a really good intro to using a crochet hook. So the tutorial I've got is very like step by step, and I try and show you how to do it even if you've never crocheted before. It's actually pretty simple. But in the same sort of vein, because you're crocheting and you're not sewing, again, you don't have to cut the yarn. And so what that let me do actually is that, let me see if I can stand up. So I did the side seam all the way up to here, up until the underarm. And then because the yarn was still attached to the ball, it let me just pick up all of the stitches around the armhole and then join to work in the round, and then work the armhole ribbing. So again, this crochet seam all the way up the side, and then all of the all of the like sleeve ribbing is just one continuous piece of yarn. Same thing on the other side. And so that was nice because there were just less ends to weave in. Then once all of that was done, I pretty much had a top. It just was quite short. It ended up being right around my belly button, I think. And so I just put all of the stitches from the provisional cast on back onto the needles. Also, I did the bottom panel in like one big round. So I didn't do a front piece and a back piece and then seam them together again because it was already attached, like the front and the back panels were already attached. When I picked up the stitches, I just picked them all up and I worked them in the round and worked them down. The one downside to this is that, this is getting a bit technical, but stitches when you work provisionally, so when you're working up in one direction and then down in the other direction and there's a provisional cast on in the middle, at the point where the provisional cast on was, all of the stitches are sort of offset by half a column. So if you look at normal knitting, your columns all look like this. But if you're doing a provisional cast on like I'm describing, where the line was, where your cast on was, they all look sort of like this. Which, with something like stockinette, it's not a problem because you really can't tell. But I realized that on the back panel of this, the lines of the back ribbing actually line up with the lines of the bottom ribbing. They're just less frequent at the bottom. But because I couldn't make them line up exactly because of the way the provisional cast on worked, then I just intentionally offset them so that the bottom ribbing lines show up halfway in between the ribbing lines from the top. So yeah, that's how I made my top. I constructed it very differently to what was recommended, but hopefully there are some tips in there for you. The other main tip that I have for this top is that if you are someone who knows how to do a left and a right twist, still definitely read the abbreviations because she did a really good job of doing them in a way that I just haven't seen before. I'm not going to give it away because it is a paid for pattern, but it means that these diagonal lines are really, really, really prominent and like they look really nicely defined, but it is slightly different to a normal left and right twist. So just make sure you read the abbreviations. So that's my terrain tee. Big thank you to our knitters for sending me the kit. I was, I'm very appreciative and it's a really nice top. It's very hot still in Sydney, like unreasonably hot for March. So I haven't worn it much yet because it is 10-ply yarn, so it's a little bit on the thicker side even though it's cotton. I'm hoping it'll cool down soon, but we'll see. So those are my FOs. And now we get on to the whips, which I've got some stories for you all. Okay, I'm not going to do this exactly in order, but let me try and show you what I've been up to. So the first thing that I have is Wes's jumper. If you've been following along here for a while, then you will be excited to know that I finally cast the thing on after talking about it for months and months and months. If you haven't been here for a while, essentially this is a jumper for my husband. It's meant to be for his birthday, which we'll talk about in a sec. And I've been planning it for so long. It's probably been like a year at this point. Basically, he never wants me to knit him anything for various reasons, most of which are quite kind. Essentially, he doesn't want me to waste my knitting time because he knows how much time I spend on knitting and how much I like knitting. And he's quite picky with his clothes, so he doesn't really want me to end up making something that he doesn't like after spending like a bunch of time on it. And he just doesn't know how much he will like something before it's actually like sitting in front of his face. But he finally agreed to let me make him a jumper. We've spent a very long time choosing patterns and yarns. So what we have finally settled on is a cardigan called Porter, which is from Hudson & West. I'll pop a picture of it up here. But he wants it as a jumper, so I'm going to make some mods to the front to turn it from a cardigan into a jumper. And the yarn we've chosen is Wool of the Andes from Knit Picks because I wanted something non-superwash, because I figured it would make the cables pop more nicely and it would just like last longer and not stretch out quite as much. And he wanted like an orangey brown color, so this is Persimmon Heather. I also got some of the superwash one because he doesn't like itchy yarn, so I got some superwash yarn to do the cuffs and the big shawl collar, so it's not quite as scratchy at the bits where it's like hitting his skin. And the nice thing about Wool of the Andes is that, I don't know if this is true of all the weights, but at least in the worsted and the bulky, which is between 10 and 14 ply for my Aussie friends, it comes in both superwash and non-superwash versions, and they have the same colors, so you can get both and use them sort of like in combination. So I have sleeves. Sleeves plural. It is not just one sleeve, which I'll talk about in a sec. And yeah, they're done. So it is a raglan jumper. It's a seamed raglan jumper, which is confusing me, but it is what it is. And good Lord, men's jumpers just go on for miles. Look how long this sleeve is. It just kept going and going. Like, what in the world? So the cabling detail is really pretty. It's these two cable panels here on the sides and then a different one that runs up the middle. And what can I tell you about this? It was pretty straightforward. I did do them 2 at a time. And so when you're knitting flat, setting up for 2 at a time is really easy. So if you've ever worked sleeves or socks in the round 2 at a time, you'll know that casting on is really tricky. But when you do it 2 at a time flat, it's actually really easy. You just cast on and then you attach a new ball of yarn and cast on for the other piece of whatever it is you're making. And then you just work them 2 at a time. The thing that I found actually quite tricky is that when you're working 2 at a time in the round, it's really obvious like where you should be knitting and what direction that you're going in. But when you work flat, just imagine that like these 2 things were on the needles. So you're knitting across this way, and then you drop your yarn and you pick up the second ball of yarn and you're knitting across this way. So what happens is that it can be really easy to forget that you need to do right side, and then wrong side. And sometimes what I find is that you can accidentally go right side to here and then wrong side back this way. And so that means that it's really easy to accidentally get a row higher on one side or the other. And if you're really not concentrating, you can end up with like quite a few rows higher on one side than the other. It seems really obvious and like easy to remember when it's like 2 things that are this skinny. But when you're dealing with 2 things that are as wide as they are down here, and you've got circular needles, so the yarn's all like bending around and like the material's all offset on the cable and stuff, it can be really hard to tell where you're up to. So the big tip that I have for you guys, which I figured out sort of halfway through doing the sleeves, and I wish I'd have figured out earlier, is that if you are doing 2 at a time flat, pin the bits together in the middle. Don't do it right at the top on your needles. Do it like, I don't know, a couple of centimeters down, and then just move that stitch marker or the pin or whatever it is that you're using up every so often. And I found that made it really obvious for me when I should be continuing on and when I should be turning to move to the wrong side or the right side. And it helped a lot. As soon as I did that, I just like stopped making mistakes. Because I did really keep accidentally going higher on one side than the other, which was really bad, especially in a pattern like this, because the increases and the cable pattern are very like dependent on each other. And so if you got the increases in the wrong place and the cable pattern in the wrong place and you lost track of which, it was bad. So yeah, pinning them together really helped. The other thing that I did, which I don't normally do, is I left all of these stitch markers in for you so you could see, but I used a bunch of removable stitch markers to show me where the raglan decreases and increases were. And that way it made it really easy to see how many I had done. Because with this sleeve in particular, there was lots of increases all the way up to here and then lots of decreases all the way down to there because it is a raglan. And those increases and decreases happened at a different rate. So like you work up for a while and then you change how often you do your increase, and then same thing with the decreases, you work for a while and then you decrease faster or slower or whatever. And so what I did is that I just kept putting stitch markers in so I could count how many decreases I'd done. And then when I had to change the rate of the decrease, I took all the stitch markers out and I started a new set of stitch markers, so it was easier to count how many of that type of decrease that I'd done. So yeah, those are the sleeves. They took about 2 weeks, which, okay, I feel like a dummy. I've been planning this jumper for months, and I got to the end of February and I was like, hooray, I can finally cast on Wes's jumper. His birthday's at the end of March, and then I was like, wait, why have I left it this late? How am I expecting to knit this jumper in a month? And I don't think I'm going to get it done. If it was the only thing I was working on, or if the other things I was working on were simple, I could probably get it done. But neither of those two things are the case, and you'll see why in a second. So I'm planning on making the back, which should be really straightforward, and then I'll have to sit down and look at the mods for the front. I think they should be pretty straightforward, but we'll see how we go. I'm thinking of filming this as I go, so I may end up with a vlog that's just about this jumper. So that could be fun to watch if you're interested. The one thing that I will say is that this pattern is not for the faint of heart. Couple of reasons. First off, it's not an older style pattern. It's just written intentionally for intermediate or advanced knitters, I'd say, because it says things like, do the increases, keep the basket weave pattern in pattern. Or like, do the decreases and remember to like remove the cables when there's not enough stitches for the cable. And so if you're a newer knitter and you're used to seeing things that are like knit 1, decrease, knit 2, purl 2, knit 2, purl 2, like that's not going to be some like information that you'll find in this pattern. I've done enough knitting classes now to know that the like difference in information you get in different knitting patterns frustrates people in both directions. I've seen experienced knitters who get really frustrated when there's too much information in a pattern, and I've seen newer knitters who get really frustrated when there's not enough information in a pattern. And so if you're curious either way why this is a thing that happens, essentially when you're writing a knitting pattern, it's not just the instructions you have to keep in mind. There's also considerations about space and detail and verbosity. And the problem is that if you know your audience are more advanced knitters, spelling out every instruction takes a lot of space, and it's also a lot of information to digest, and sometimes it even confuses people. Having too much information can sometimes be more confusing or as confusing as not having enough information. So when you're writing a pattern, as the designer, you sort of have to choose who you're targeting it as an audience, and that sort of informs how much information you put into a pattern. Because for something like this, where there's decreases going along with cables, going along with basket seed, or basket weave. So let me show you quickly. The basket weave is this here on the side. So when you've got lots of different textures and cables and increases and decreases and all sorts of things going on, it's really, really, really hard to write the pattern out row by row by row by row and tell people exactly what they should be doing on every row, because honestly you'd end up with a pattern that was like 100 pages long. So it's not a good or a bad thing that they've chosen to target the pattern to more advanced knitters. Just know that if you are planning on making something like this, You've got to pick your patterns carefully so that they're targeted at the level that you need them to be at. That being said, there are some things about the pattern that are frustrating me a bit. There are just some things that were not written as clearly as I think they could be. If you do decide to make this pattern, first off, sometimes it says decrease every 8th round, and sometimes it says decrease every 8 rounds. And at first I was quite confused because I wasn't sure if I should be doing different things, but it's the same thing. They just write it as 8th sometimes and 8 sometimes. The other thing is that read all the way through the pattern, because there are tips on how to do the decreases into the cable panels, but for some reason they include those tips sort of halfway through the pattern after you need them. So you do decreases into the cables for the sleeves, and then you also do decreases into the cables for the body, but you do the sleeves first and they don't give the tips until the body section. So it would be handy if they took those tips and put them before the sleeves so you knew how to do them for the sleeve section. So definitely skip ahead a bit and look for that information before you start doing the sleeve decreases. So the reason that I don't think I'm going to get that done is that my other whip, well, my other main whip at the moment is, I always get the names mixed up, Sabo. It's Sabo by Needy Knits. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong. I'm sure I could have asked Ira. My friend Ira is also a podcaster, but she knows how to pronounce Hindi words, and I probably should have asked her. Sorry, Ira. But this is a pattern by Needy Knits. It is this beautiful giant shawl that is made up of panels of garter stitch in a fingering weight or 4-ply yarn, and mohair in a regular sort of 2-ply lace weight mohair yarn. And what effect that gives is that you end up with these gorgeous sections of just see-through short row wavy things. And this thing is so big that it's really, really hard to show you what it looks like now. I'm pretty sure at this point there are about 600 stitches on the needles. No more, 630 or something like that. But that's what it looks like at the moment. I don't know if I have a picture of it, because even just laying out on the floor is really hard to do. But I will definitely post a picture of the final object, the final project from the pattern designer, just so you can get a sense of what it is that I'm doing. So the yarn is this beautiful camel and silk mix from Bijou Basin Ranch, who don't produce yarn anymore, but I don't have the label on me, I don't think. But it is, I'm pretty sure, a mix of camel and silk, which I think the camel, from what I understand, doesn't take dye as well as the silk does, so it gives it this gorgeous heathered look, plus the silk makes it shiny. So I had one skein of this solid green color, and then another skein of this greeny purpley yellow color, and I striped them together here on this garter stitch section and this garter stitch section. So that way it sort of went from green to a mix of just the green and the speckles to just straight up speckles down here at the bottom. I guess speckles is the wrong word. Variegated yarn. Basically, it gets less and less green as it goes on. So it's been a really beautiful project to work on. Just the overall effect is really pretty. And it's, oh my gosh, it's so soft. It feels like butter, honestly. This yarn, man, if I could find some more of it, I wish they hadn't gone out of business because it's beautiful. But, okay, so here's the thing. This was supposed to be my easy project. I usually have an easy project and a hard project on the needles, so I can switch between the two when I need to give my brain a break from the harder project. And it was quite easy. These garter stitch sections here, they're just garter stitch, so you just knit all the way through. And then the short row sections took a little bit more concentration, but I would just sort of sit down when I had some time and just bang them out. And then I'd be back onto an easier section for when I went to a knit night or, a meetup or whatever. The problem is that I got to the bottom border and I hadn't read through the instructions. I was just like, oh, that looks really pretty. So if you look at the pictures, the bottom border is all mohair with bubbles of the fingering weight yarn. So I actually have a different 4-ply yarn for the bottom. It's this purple yarn that I got from my parents when they went to Copenhagen. So all this yarn is really quite special to me. And the thing is that I didn't really think about it. I was like, okay, cool, there's a border. Finally read through the instructions. Okay, so let me show you the swatch. So this is generally what the bottom border looks like. Mohair panel, bubbles. Now, if you're wondering how you do that, turns out the answer is you cut lots of long strings of yarn and use them all individually to knit the bubbles. So one strand of yarn works for one diagonal line worth of bubbles. So first off, you have to cut your yarn into pieces, which freaks me out. I sat down and figured out how many pieces I needed to cut, and you need 96. So somehow you attach all 96 strands of yarn separately on the first row of the bubbles, and then you knit with all of them attached. So the designer did provide links to tutorials and stuff on how to do this. And so the reason that I have a swatch is twofold. One, I wanted to see if I should hold the yarn double, because this purple yarn is actually quite a bit thinner than a standard 4-ply, I think. It's probably closer to either a 3 or a 2-ply. And so I wasn't sure if I'd need to hold it double or single for the bubbles. Thankfully, I decided that the single was fine. The double-stranded bubbles they poke out almost a bit too much. And so the reason I made a swatch, first I wanted to check if I should do a single or double. And then also, what you do to figure out how long the strands of yarn should be is you can make a swatch and then you unravel it, and then you take a look at how long a strand you used for the bubbles, and then you use that to measure out the rest of the strands of yarn. So I did message the designer just to double check that this is what I should be doing and I wasn't misreading the instructions, because I didn't want to go cutting all my yarn up and then realize that I was doing it wrong. And yes, this is how you're meant to do it. So I'm just going to sit down and do it one day, I think. So she did suggest that you don't cut them all at the start. You just cut a length or 3 or 4 or 5 and then work with those and then cut the next set and then keep working with those. But I am unsure of how much of this purple yarn I actually have. And so I want to cut all the lengths first, because I want to see how much I have left over after that, because there are a couple of options that she gives. You can do the final couple of rows of the main shawl body in the contrast color, and I need to save it as well for the bind off. So I need to know how much yarn I need for the bubble sections so I can make decisions after that on what to do with the other sections that I could potentially need the purple for. Now, the complicating factor in all of this is that I decided that I was going to enter this in the Easter show. If you are not from Sydney, the Easter show is our big agricultural show that we have in sort of April, well, around Easter. And it's due at the end of next week. So I've had to put Wes's jumper down. I've told him that he's probably just going to get sleeves for his birthday. But to be fair, it's still too hot for him to wear that thing anyway. So he said it's okay. So I'm not going to work on that for a bit until I finish the shawl. Also, I hope you all appreciate that I kept this swatch for you because my first instinct was to make it and then immediately rip it out, because frogging mohair is I found that the longer you let it sit in knitted form, the harder it is to frog. And so I just wanted to rip it out immediately so that I could just measure how long the purple strands needed to be. But I saved it for you so I could show you. So I hope you all appreciate that. It does mean, though, I get to test the theory that mohair is easy to frog when you throw it in the freezer. So I'm going to go throw it in the freezer and see how we go. So Oh, speaking of the mohair, I did forget to mention that this mohair is just like a regular mohair lace. Wait, sorry. It's a regular mohair and silk blend in 2-ply, and it is from Louis and Lola. The color I think is called olive green. It's this gorgeous, like, mostly green with little speckles of gold, which worked out really well because there are little gold specks in the variegated yarn that I was using for the main section. This isn't actually going to be the yarn that I use for the border though, because when I finished this whole thing and got to the end of the short rows, it worked out perfectly because all I had left was this little bit of mohair right here, and definitely not enough to do the border. So I knew that I was going to run out of the green, so I also got just some like undyed mohair. This is from Mel from 3 Cats Yarn. She gave me a skein, but I think actually this is going to be almost too much. So I'm going to save this up for something else and use... I'll go get it. I'm just going to use this ball that I have in stash. I have about 25 grams of it, I think. And yep, 25 grams, 210 meters. So that should be plenty for the border. It is Kremke Soul Wool in Silky Kid. So that's my big shawl. If you're curious to see how this whole cutting process goes, I will take some videos and show you next podcast episode. I will probably also make an Instagram reel so you can all share my pain. So if you want to see it before the next podcast episode, then just go find me on Instagram in a couple of days. And I should have some clips of me doing it on there. So the last whip that I have is another Homecoming Honeycombs beanie. So if you haven't seen this before, this is a pattern that I released back in August or September? August, end of August. It is a beanie and it's got this cool hexagon pattern on it. I call it honeycomb stitch because it looks like honeycombs to me. And it looks much better blocked, so I will show you a picture of what it looks like finished. Now the reason that I'm making another one is I just really like this pattern. I think I've made like 6 of them now. This is a stitch that I've always just really liked. I've made quite a few baby blankets out of it and then I worked it into a beanie pattern. So I've made heaps of them at this point. But the reason that I'm making it right now is that I'm going to be publishing this with Knit Picks. So they put out a newsletter once a month. They ask all the indie designers on their list to make submissions for if they want to be in the email that month. And so I submitted this and I got accepted. So I think this is going to be in the newsletter in like May. I'm not entirely sure. But I need to get a move on so I can finish it off. This definitely is an easy pattern, so it's nice to have something that's a bit of a break from the 2 other fairly intense things that I've got going on. So the yarn is Chroma Worsted, which is 10-ply, which actually the pattern was originally written for the rainbow yarn to be an 8-ply, but I tried it with the 10-ply and it's totally fine. So this is what this color looks like. I wound it into a cake because it's nice seeing the gradient colors, and this color is called Pegasus. And then the contrast color is Swish. And this is in an 8-ply. Now, the reason that I used a different contrast color is that this stuff is beautiful, but it's also single ply. And so it can, like I was saying with the scarf, it can felt a bit more easily or it can like pill quite a bit. And so I don't want to use it for the bottom border because that's what's going to hit your head most of the time. So I just got a more regular plied yarn. And this stuff is gorgeous. I haven't used Swish before, but it's so soft. It's also merino and it's just really, yeah, it's so squishy. So would highly recommend. I've been really loving working with this. So I cast this on like 2 days ago and I had some issues with my gauge. I did do a swatch, but then it looked like my gauge was too tight. So I went up a needle size and just started knitting the beanie. And then after I got like down to here on the beanie, I realized that the gauge on the larger needles was just too loose. So I frogged it all, started again on the smaller needles, and that's worked out much better. So this is written for a 4mm needle at the top section and then a 375 for the ribbing. The only other thing I wanted to mention is color management. So when you're working with something like this, it does really help to wind your ball into a skein so you can see the colors in your gradient. So I'm very much a purple person, so I knew that I wanted this bright purple color. And when I wound it up, I noticed that it would be a really long time before I got back to that purple color. Because if you can imagine, like, the purple's coming up really soon, but I've already used all of this yarn. And so I didn't want to miss out on the purple color. And I wasn't sure if the beanie would even get there, which obviously it hasn't because it stopped at this like green. So what I ended up doing was unwinding my swatch, which had used up all of the light purple yarn, and then I used that to cast on, and then I did the rest of the yarn out of the ball. And so I'm glad that I bothered to do that because I do really like this purple. And yeah, so that's my Homecoming Honeycombs beanie. I do not know how I'm going to take pictures of this thing. So when I mentioned that it's hot, it's currently 35 degrees, which is vaguely ridiculous for March. So usually summer in Sydney, like you hardly even hit 35 and up, at least in like the part of Sydney that I'm in. It's really rare to hit 35 and up, even at like the height of summer. Like you'll usually get a couple of like 30 to 40 degree days, but not that many. So the fact that we're still getting them in March is like really strange. It's freaking me out. It's making me worried that the winter's going to be really long, but we'll see. For my American friends, I looked this up. 35 is like in the high 90s. It's like 98 or something ridiculous. So I don't know how I'm going to take photos of this beanie because I need them for the pattern and the Knit Picks newsletter. So I'm probably going to take them inside with the air conditioning on and wear a jumper and pretend like it's winter. Take some sort of cozy photos without dying of the heat. Okay, so that's all my whips and FOs, and the next section of my podcast is Off the Needles, which is where we talk about life things, sometimes knitting related, sometimes not. Today it's very much not. So I'll try and keep this short because I do realize that I've been yammering on about all this stuff for a really long time. So what I wanted to talk about today is playing tourist in your own town. So I've lived in Sydney the vast majority of my life. The only significant amount of time that I've spent outside of Sydney is when I lived in New York, which was like 3.5 years. Other than that, I did some shorter stints, lived a couple of months in San Francisco, a couple of months in Vietnam, in Ho Chi Minh City. Now, I do know that it's pretty much just a generally accepted phenomenon that when you are visiting somewhere and playing tourist, you go see all the touristy things, and when you're home, you just sort of like stay home. And I found myself with a lot of time on my hands recently, and so I decided I would try and go play tourist in Sydney because I've realized that Sydney is very large and I've spent most of my life in a very small part of it, just like spending all my time in the same sort of like areas. So I've been trying to actually like be, intentional about getting out of my little bubble in the last month or so, and it's been really fun. So most of the way that I've done this is through walks. There's lots of really beautiful coastal walks in Sydney. There's like recommended walking trails around the harbour and stuff. So I'll try and include some footage here, but on my birthday I took myself on the Spit to Manly walk, which is about a 4-hour walk if you do it end to end. And I've done parts of it before, but I've never done the whole thing. I will try and put some maps and stuff up on the screen just because I'm sure a lot of you aren't from Sydney. So just to give you a sense of like where things are. So I live in the North Shore and the Spit to Manly walk is in what's called the Northern Beaches. So it's not too far from my house. Started out with something sort of close to home. And that was beautiful because there's lots of beaches along that walk, and so I got to just walk for a while and then stop at a beach and go swimming for a bit and then walk some more, and then I caught the ferry from Manly to the city. And then I went home on the bus like normal. And then, so it was really lovely. And then I also mentioned this like plan or general idea to my best friend. And she took me down to Cronulla, which is an area in the south that's like about an hour away from where I live. And genuinely, I don't know if I've ever been to Cronulla. And it was beautiful. I've just never been to Cronulla Beach. It is gigantic, like actually just goes on forever. And we didn't go on a walk or anything, but we went out to lunch at this like gorgeous little restaurant on the beach, and then we went shopping and stuff. So it was really fun. And that's actually where I took the photos of my terrain tea, which is why the photos look all beachy. And then I went on a walk with my sister. We went to the eastern suburbs, but like the northern part of the eastern suburbs. So I've done the Bondi to Bronte walk quite a bit. And if you're not from Sydney, it's highly likely that if you've ever heard of one beach from Sydney, it's Bondi. That is in the eastern suburbs, but like actually on the eastern coast. And so we went walking in like the upper part of the eastern suburbs. Again, it was not a walk that I'd done before. And my sister pointed out, because she did live in that area at some point, after living all of her life in the north like I had, she was like, it's just, you get the opposite view of the city. It's just like, it's amazing how little novel things can change your perspective on stuff quite dramatically. It did just genuinely look different. And so that was really nice. So it's just been really nice getting out to play tourist with some of my favorite people and go on these lovely like sunny beach walks. And yeah, so I would highly encourage you to go exploring your own city and getting out of your bubble a little bit if that's something you feel like doing, because it just makes it really nice and like makes things feel sort of fresh and new. My next adventure that I'm planning is that I really want to get out to Cabramatta and find some really good Vietnamese food, because that's where you get Vietnamese food from in Sydney, and I really miss all the food from Vietnam. So if any of you are from Sydney and you know where the best banzeo is to get from Cabramatta, please let me know, because I really want a good crepe. Okay, the last segment of my podcast is up next, which is where I talk about what I'm getting up to in the next month or so. Yeah, I've told you what I'm planning on doing, gonna do it. So I need to finish my beanie, and then I need to finish the scarf. If I win a prize at the Easter show, I will be very happy. But even if I don't, I'm just going to be very glad that I did the scarf. Definitely going to be an experience. We'll see how we go. And then I think I'm just going to work on the jumper. Like I said, I normally have 2 projects, but I'm just going to work on the jumper. Get it done. Give it to Wes for his late birthday. Possibly for our wedding anniversary in May, depending on how long it takes to finish. And then after that, I don't know what's on my needles next. Probably some baby blankets, because I have some friends who are pregnant. In terms of Oliphant cat stuff, I do have some teaching things going on. So if you're going to be at the River Yarn Festival in early April, then I will see you there, because I'm going to be teaching some workshops. And that is in, oh gosh, I don't even know how to pronounce this town, Karakoa. I am getting to explore parts of New South Wales that I've never been to, so that's really cool. And yeah, just going to go hang out, teach some classes, possibly, hopefully buy some yarn. Maybe not, we'll see. Trying to keep my stash down. And then other than that, I'm still trying to line up some extra teaching gigs, because I've realized that I do really want to focus on teaching. I also started doing some Zoom classes one-on-one with people. So if that's something that you're interested in, just get in touch, because yeah, I just like teaching people things. And if you have questions or need some help with a project, I'm more than happy to sit down with you on Zoom. And then I do think I'm going to get back into the Oliphant cat work. So I'm planning on restarting tech editing. So if you're a designer who needs an editor, just let me know. For those of you who've already asked me, I know you're waiting for me to confirm. Yes, I think I'm going to be getting back into editing. So I will send out an email soon with details on how to book edits and stuff. Other than that, yeah, just thank you for hanging around. I meant for this to be a shorter episode, and as always, it is very long. So if you're still here and you did get something out of this video, please hit the like button down below, because that helps YouTube know that people like this and it shows it to more people. And if you are not already a subscriber, then if you want to keep in touch and keep up to date with what I'm doing, then you can subscribe using the button down below, or you can hit this big button right here. And if you want to catch up on any past podcast episodes, there's a playlist of them right here. But other than that, I've been Kat from Oliphant Cat, and I will see you next month. Happy knitting!